Okay, I'm here with Dr. Avi Mintz. I'm Ben Blair. We're going to read a couple vignettes from Emile in book 3. We're reading from the Alan Bloom translation. And this, I'm going to start, this vignette comes on page 170 of the Alan Bloom translation. And here's Emile, or here's Rousseau talking with Emile. Or we're experiencing this with Emile. We have seen the sun rising on Midsummer Day. We also go to see it rising on Christmas Day or some other fair winter day, for you know that we are not lazy and that we make a game of braving the cold. I am careful to make this second observation in the same place where we made the first. And provided that some skill, so the second observation of observing the sun rising on Midsummer Day and on Christmas Day. And provided that some skill has been used in preparing the observation, one or the other will not fail to cry out, oh, here is something funny. The sun does not rise any more in the same place. Here are our old markers, and now it is rising over there, etc. There is then a summer east and a winter east, etc. Young master, you are now on your way. These examples ought to suffice for you to teach the celestial sphere very clearly while taking the earth as the earth and the sun as the sun. In general, never substitute the sign for the thing except when it is impossible for you to show the latter. Or let me read that again. In general, never substitute the sign for the thing except when it is impossible for you to show the latter, for the sign absorbs the child's attention and makes him forget the thing represented. So there's that one. Then I'm moving over on page 171. This is the last sentence of the first paragraph. While the child studies the celestial sphere and is thus transported into the heavens, lead him back to the division of the earth and show him first his own habitat. His first 2 points of geography will be the city in which he dwells and his father's country house. Then will come the intermediate places, then the neighboring rivers, and finally the sun's position and the way of orienting oneself by it. This is the meeting place. Let him make a map of all these things himself, a very simple map, at first formed by 2 objects alone, to which he adds the others little by little, to the extent that he knows or estimates their distance and their position. You see already what an advantage we have procured for him in putting a compass in his eyes. And skipping a little bit in the next paragraph. Moreover, the goal is not that he know exactly the topography of the region, but that he know the means of learning about it. It is of little importance that he have maps in his head, provided that he is able to get a good conception of what they represent, and that he has a distinct idea of the art which serves to draw them. See the difference there already in between your pupil's knowledge and mine's ignorance. They know maps, and he makes them. Here are new ornaments for his room. So those are a couple vignettes from book 3. And Avi, I'd love to hear any commentary or thoughts you have on those.
So those are good. They're very rich. And I think there's one way we can look at them in terms of the ideas here and how they influenced later people. So what is Rousseau saying here? Well, he's saying that the way that we traditionally teach children, like when we want them to learn something about geography and maps, for example, like or the position of the sun, I guess that would be astronomy. There's a way that schools traditionally teach those things, in both Rousseau's day and our own. They would sit the child down and they'd maybe give them a textbook, or the teacher would provide a lecture. And so he says that's wrong. And this is what's influential. And people who've said that they call themselves progressive educators or child-centered or student-centered educators, or sometimes say that they're interested in discovery learning or experiential learning, that's all in Rousseau here. That's exactly what he's saying. So you're not going to just hand over knowledge about the subject, about geography or about astronomy. Rather, you are going to have Emile engaged actively and discover his own knowledge about it. So that's why Rousseau is influential, and that's what's interesting about him. So the question is, so why does Rousseau think that's important? So I could say, it strikes me that there's a couple of things that he returns to again and again about why it's better to teach children this way, where they're actively engaged in learning rather than telling them. One is that it's much better to have students intrinsically motivated. If they're investigating because they actually care about finding the answer to something, that's going to be way more effective when they're learning. It's going to help them remember it. It's going to help them understand than if you just tell them something they're not interested in. So much of this book, Rousseau talks again and again about wasting time and losing time. He thinks we're in such a rush to do things that would be done so much more effectively if we just waited till kids were interested in doing them. So that's part of it. That's maybe I'd say the first important idea here is this idea, the importance of intrinsic motivation in learning. Next, Rousseau, this is part of a broader political idea for Rousseau, that people are usually brought up in, when they bring up children, they want them to be compliant, and he says, well, that's great if you want kids to learn to just listen to the authority and obey the authority of others. But he says, what does that give you as an adult? It gives you, he says, in a couple of pages later here, I'll just grab on page 178, right in the middle of the page, he says, so it's in the paragraph that starts with "let the child do nothing," and it's about 4 or 5 sentences in. He says, you want him to be docile when little. That is to want him to be credulous and a dupe when he is grown up. So you make the child submit, you turn him into an adult that submits. And he's really interested in people who are free and independent. And so if you're constantly just under the thumb of authority, both like in your home and in a school or in a learning situation, he thinks that's actually not cultivating the right kind of intellect at all. So, so those two things are important: intrinsic motivation, not bowing to authority. And yeah, maybe that's a good place for me to pause. How does that sound, Ben? Or do you have anything else that strikes you about those passages?
So intrinsically motivated, and what was the second part you said?
The not submitting to authority, to be an independent thinker, and to be free in like a robust way as an adult. You need to not spend a childhood constantly under the thumb of authority.
Right. Yeah, I see. So in these two examples, where the one is he's discovering that the sun is rising at different places, so that's one, and then he is making a map based on, even if it's not exactly correct, it's making a map of what he's familiar with, and contrasting that with, how would we teach where the sun rises now? We sit a kid down and say, hey, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. In the fall, it rises at this place. It rises this many degrees to the west. And now let's see how well our kids can show off that knowledge that they've memorized from the teacher telling them what the answer was. And that contrasted with, or, let's see what locations the students can find on this map that we provided for them. And they can really show off, and it's really impressive, or we think it's really impressive. But the cost of that is the students don't really know. They haven't learned for themselves. They've memorized this, and they don't have a sense for, again, you mentioned discovery learning. This isn't something they've discovered. It's something they've repeated. Yeah. It's not something they know. It's something they've, again, repeated. They've regurgitated. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think that's so right. Just one other, he says this on page 172, kind of there's a few places he says this sort of thing. This is a nice one where it's pretty clear that he's not interested in handing over knowledge, but in helping students become learners who can acquire their own knowledge. So that sounds in many ways like a modern argument. You hear people saying all the time now, like, well, we don't need them to memorize things because everybody has the entire world of knowledge in their pocket on their phone, but we need to help them like to understand, to be able to obtain that knowledge, to be able to discern what are good sources they're using and not valid ideas that they're seeing. But anyway, let's look at just 172 in the first full paragraph that starts with during the first age. So a little towards the end of the paragraph, he says, the issue is not to teach him the sciences, but to give him the taste for loving them and methods for learning them when this taste is better developed. This is very certainly a fundamental principle of every good education. So the idea is to equip Emile with the tools to be, as we would say now, a lifelong learner, or he is learning to learn rather than acquiring knowledge in his education. And Rousseau gives a lot of other examples, like the one that you had read, the vignettes you read. In fact, one of those vignettes is highly relevant. He builds up to this incident where he takes Emile out into the forest. It seems a little cruel, and he gets lost, or at least he tells Emile that they're lost, and Emile is hungry and he's crying. By the way, if you have the Bloom edition, this is on page 180 to 181, and all of these vignettes, we're dealing with stuff that's very early in book 3 if you're using a different translation. And so Emile is crying, and then Rousseau says, I don't know how we're ever going to get out of the forest, or something like this to make him worry. And then he says, but wait, what were we studying about the position of the sun the other day? So then he uses this like very gentle suggestion, and then Emile starts reasoning, wait a second, the shadows are this way, it's about this time of day, that means north is this direction, and then south is that direction. And then lo and behold, Emile figures out how to find his way home. Rousseau says, that's how you teach. You don't give lectures and speeches, but you want the students to do the work on their own. One other thing that he says that proved very prescient and relevant today. Today we talk a lot, especially for teachers, about the importance of students making mistakes and thinking of, like in the whole Carol Dweck framework, of having a growth mindset. So understanding mistakes is an important part of learning and not being afraid of learning. And Rousseau says that exact thing too. Like, the mistakes are important. Learning happens in those errors where you're confronted with what you don't know. And so Emile should not be protected from those things. In fact, he should be led to situations where there is tension, or sometimes dramatic tension, like when he gets lost in the forest, where he's done something wrong, like lost track of where he is, and then he needs to work through it. That's learning. That's productive.
I love it. And I mean, that vignette, it's not too long. I think let's read through that and get Rousseau's language for this, because it's great. So I'm on 181, okay. And I'll start. So they're lost, quote unquote. And so the first new paragraph on 181. After some moments of silence, I say to him with a worried air, my dear Emile, what shall we do to get out of here? Emile, all in a sweat and crying hot tears, I don't know. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. I can't go on. Do you believe I'm in a better condition than you? And do you think I would, this is Jean-Jacques speaking, and do you think I would blame myself for crying if my tears would do for my lunch? Crying isn't what has to be done. What we have to do is find ourselves. Let's see your watch. What time is it? Emile, it's noon. I haven't eaten. Jean-Jacques, that's true. It is noon and I haven't eaten. Emile, oh, how hungry you must be. Jean-Jacques, the misfortune is that my dinner won't come and look for me here. It is noon? That is exactly the time yesterday when we were observing the position of the forest from Montmorency. If we could observe the position of Montmorency from the forest in the same way, Emile, yes, but yesterday we saw the forest, and from here we don't see the city. Jean-Jacques, That's the difficulty. If we could find its position without seeing it. Emile, oh, my good friend. Jean-Jacques, did we not say that the forest was? Emile, north of Montmorency. Jean-Jacques, consequently, Montmorency ought to be. Emile, south of the forest. Jean-Jacques, we have a means of finding the north at noon. Emile, yes, but the direction of the shadow. Jean-Jacques, but the south? Emile, what's to be done? Jean-Jacques, south is the opposite of north. Emile, that's true. We have only to look for the opposite of the shadow. Oh, there is the south. There is the south. Surely Montmorency is in that direction. Let's look in that direction. Jean-Jacques, you might be right. Let's take this path through the woods. Emile, clapping his hands and letting out a cry of joy. Oh, I see Montmorency. There it is, straight ahead of us in full view. Let's have lunch. Let's dine. Let's run fast. Astronomy is good for something. Note that if he does not say this last phrase, he will think it. What is the difference, provided that it is not I who say it? Now, you can be certain that he will not in this life forget this day's lesson. Whereas, if I had only made him suppose all this in his room, my speech would have been forgotten the very next day. One must speak as much as one can by deeds and say only what one does not know how to do.
Yeah.
Stop there.
Yeah, it's great. So some people have read Rousseau as being totally laissez-faire, hands off, just let kids run wild. This example shows that he doesn't actually think that, right? Jean-Jacques is really involved in concocting this scenario. There's been thought put into this, like he's been thinking about the sun days in advance. And so he's really involved, but he thinks the important thing is that his authority needs to be basically hidden, right? Emile needs to believe that he's doing this investigation and reaching these conclusions himself, because the learning has to go on inside the learner. And this is a great example of why Rousseau, how Rousseau thinks that will work. Doesn't every teacher want the student to say at the end of the lesson that what they've just learned is good for
Algebra
something?
is good for something. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's all sorts of wonderful fantasy in this book for Rousseau.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that is, I mean, on my count, those are 3 different vignettes from book 3. The noticing that the sun rises in different places, making his own map, and then finding his way out of the forest. So, and I think those tell some different from the vignettes in book 2 or book 1, where Emile is doing some more, this is more involved work than what he's expected to do or what he's expected to be able to accommodate, which is really what he's doing in book 1 and book 2, where book 3, he's expanding in more deliberate, intelligent ways. Any other thoughts on those vignettes?
No, but there are really great examples of how Rousseau thinks when Emile gets to the age. So this is book 3, and Emile is now getting closer to 15 years old. At some point, Rousseau says you do need to start with the lessons, but if you're going to start with the lessons and what you want, with the objectives you want to teach, this is how you do it. You don't just all of a sudden go right back to textbooks and classrooms and desks.
Love it. All right. Well, those are some vignettes from Emile book 3, and thanks Avi for your expertise and insights on this. And
my pleasure.
We'll meet again on some other vignettes or some other books.
Yeah, it was fun talking to you about it. To anyone watching the video, happy reading.
All right. Bye-bye.